fermented rice, and he'll go over a cup of his sake, and then he'll go and sit outside on the veranda, lie down on a couch, and off he'd go to sleep. And most afternoons he'd be woken up by the hostess who will say, wake up, you sleepyhead. Your master will be very cross with you if you don't get home soon. And he wakes up and he rushes through the forest and he goes home, and his master is always very cross with him. Now, one afternoon, same as usual, he's gone to the hostess and he has his cup of sake and he's sitting out on the couch, and off he goes to sleep. When who passes by but 3 young boys, and they are eating cherries and spitting out the stones. And then they see the fellow lying on the couch on the veranda, and they think, let's see if we can spit those cherry stones at him. And the first boy goes and hits him on the boot. And the second boy goes and hits him on the neck. But he doesn't wake up. But the third boy, why, he goes and the cherry stone lands on top of the man's head. But it doesn't bounce off and fall on the ground. He's got a lot more hair than I have, and the cherry stone gets stuck in the curls on the side of his head. And all the boys, they think, but the hostess comes out and says, you naughty boys, don't you dare do that again. Go away. And the boys go off, and the man wakes up. And off he goes home, thinking, oh no, I'm going to be late. My master will be very cross with me. Now that night, when he's asleep, within the curls of his hair, the cherry stone begins to sprout. And soon enough, there is a small sapling growing on the top of his head. And the next time he goes to get his sake in the forest tree house, why, what does he have on top of his head? But a cherry tree growing with lots of birds flying around it and pecking the cherries off too. And he goes up to the hostess and says, oh, may I have a cup of sake? And the hostess says, how much money will you pay? And the man says, I have little money, but I've got lots of sweet cherries growing in the tree above. Did you notice I have a tree growing on my head? And the hostess said, no, I didn't. But now you've come to mention it, why? May I taste those cherries? And indeed they were the sweetest cherries, and did he get a cup or two of sake from her? And out he goes to sleep on the couch. But who comes by? Those 3 naughty boys. And they see this fellow with a tree going on his head. And the eldest boy said, look at that silly man. Go and get a saw. I will saw that tree from his head. And up he goes. And soon enough, while the man's asleep, they saw the tree from his head. And off they go. Later on, the hostess comes and says, hey man, wake up. Your master will be very cross that you're back late. Oh yes, he will. And back he runs, and his master is very cross indeed. And the next time he visits the tree house, why, goodness me, what does he have on his head? But a stump. And he goes to the woman and says, may I have some sake? And she says, yes, but what will you pay me with? And he says, well, have you noticed I have a tree stump on my head? And she says, no, I hadn't, but now you come to mention it. And the man says, yes, ever since I've had this tree stump on my head, I've had these marvellous mushrooms growing all around it. Would you like to taste some? And she did, and those mushrooms were delicious. And many a cup of sake did that young man get. And then outside on the porch he went to sleep, and those naughty boys came by again. And they said, "Oh, look at that man, sleeping there on the porch there with a tree stump on his head. Hey, go and get the axe. I'll chop that stump off his head." And soon enough, that naughty boy came back with the axe, and he chopped the stump off the man's head. Boom! And the man was woken up by the hostess, who says, "Wake up, man, your master will be cross." And he was very cross indeed that night. A few weeks later, the man comes back to the tea house, and he says, "Since I was last here, have you noticed I have a big hole in my head?" And the hostess said, "No, I didn't notice, but now you come to mention it, I can see that hole in your head is full of water. And what's that swimming around in the bottom?" And the man said, "Well, since I've had a hole in my head, every time it rains, all the water goes inside. And one morning I woke up, and there were lots of eels inside too. Would you like to try some?" And the woman put her hand into the hole in his head and picked out several wriggling eels, and she put them in the pot, and she cooked them up, and very delicious they were too. And then, when he went to sleep outside after his cup of sake, those three naughty boys came back. And they saw him there, snoring, with water in his head and wriggling full of eels. And they looked at that man and they said, "That man, we can't do anything with him. Let's leave him alone from now on." And they did. And from that day on, any time that man wanted a cup of sake, he'd just go into the forest to the tea house, and he'd give some of the eels which lived in the hole in his head to the woman of the tea house for many a cup of sake. And as far as I know, that man lived happily ever after.